You've been watching Britain, what's been happening here very closely for many years, and you've made a number of interventions. And what's your sense of how that frame can be applied to what's going on in the political landscape here, the cultural landscape here? I know, for example, just in, very recently, I know you've interviewed both Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the opposition, the leader of the British Conservative Party here, and Nigel Farage. You've interviewed him a couple of times, 2 or 3 times, I think.
Yeah,
the
twice,
leader of this disruptive new force on the right in Britain is currently polling, comfortably ahead of both Labour and the Tory party. It's the first time, in 250 years that the Tory party has not been first or second in national approval. What was your take on those two figures, and what's your sense of what's happening here politically? We're in a state of extraordinary flux and upheaval. Do you have a sense of where the country's headed from looking at it from afar?
Well, what I would hope for is that the same thing happens in the UK that happened in Canada. There's a weird parallel, it's a reversal too, because the Reform Party, of course, was predicated on at least some of the principles of the Reform Party in Canada, which is very strange.
I think it was deliberately chosen as a name for that reason.
Yeah. Well, that's a very strange occurrence. Now, what happened in Canada was that the Reform pulled the Conservatives back to a socially conservative populism and gave some intellectual voice to that, particularly in the form of Preston Manning. And then that forced a reconfiguration of the right in Canada and then a reunion.
You think that might happen here?
Well, that would be the best outcome. Like Kemi and Nigel have a real opportunity at the moment to go at each other hammer and tongs. But
they both said any kind of pact is out of the question.
Yeah, right. Yeah, sure. That's rubbish. They're not going to make a pact with the Labour Party. And if push comes to shove after an election and a coalition government became possible, they'd jump at it in a second because neither of them are clueless. And so I can understand that's part of the posturing, and part of that's even necessary.
Which of the two do you think would make the better Prime Minister?
I think you're in a fortunate situation at the moment because both of those people are pretty smart and they're both pretty tough and they're both credible. I mean, Kemi is an interesting figure. She reminds me a bit of Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She's like the moral foreigner in the Old Testament texts, right? Because there's frequently stories in the Old Testament where the Israelite population has become warped and demented in a variety of ways. So
and then a Moabite, a Ruth coming in to...
Exactly. Or Moses' father-in-law, right? Jethro, who establishes the principle of subsidiarity. So now and then you get these visionary foreigners who come back and say, you people are forgetting what you're all about. Well, Ayaan's very good at that, Hirsi Ali. She did that brilliantly.
She's much more uncompromising on her diagnosis of what's gone wrong and what needs to be put right, perhaps, than Kemi Badenoch.
She is. But she's also not as constrained. Well, that's right. She's not as constrained. But Kemi, to her credit, is very smart, a lawyer and an engineer, which is a good combination. And she can see what's valuable about the civilization of the West, particularly the UK. And she can agitate for it in a way that would be difficult for someone who wasn't an outsider. So that's very interesting.
Then why isn't she agitating, or why do some people think she's not agitating for some of the policy solutions that Nigel Farage is advocating for? For example, getting outside the jurisdiction of a foreign court in Strasbourg so that we can find it easier to regain control of the borders, for example.
Well, I think part of it is that politicians are constrained. Yes, they tend not to be icebreakers on the policy side. My experience has been that, one of the things the Conservatives in Canada have told me is that I can break the ice on certain topics, climate, say, for example, being one of them, and move the window for acceptable conversation forward, and then they can step behind me, right? And you could be cynical about that and say that they lack courage, but you don't want to get all moralistic and on your
Sure.
high horse to begin with. You might also say, well, the politicians are constrained by the necessity of broad public appeal. And if you're going to be on the bleeding edge of a discussion, to begin with, you can be in a minority position, obviously, and that's not exactly their position. But Kemi and Nigel could really, they have such an opportunity because they could one up each other. You know, I saw this a little bit in the discussion with Nigel because I know that he's a climate change skeptic, or at least a skeptic of the idiot economic policies that
He
come
thinks
out of
certainly that the trade-offs entailed by net zero will be ruinous to the working classes, to the
Right.
poor, who are always disproportionately affected by higher energy prices.
Right, and that's a good start.
Yeah.
You know, what I'd like to see happen, and this could happen in this head-to-head debate between Badenoch and Farage, I'd like to see them dare each other to abandon the climate apocalypse narrative entirely. And they can see they're in a position now where they can do that because one of them, if they're head-to-head on a certain issue, one of them could step forward a bit more. So Farage will say, for example, well, we're not going to do 2030, maybe we'll do 2050. Well, and then Badenoch could say, well, maybe we'll do 2100. And then Farage could say, how about we're just done with the whole mess, right? And they can test each other that way.
The problem is that Nigel will always be able to say that the mess began with you. The mess with, and I think that's a sort of, the Tories, I think, are very much hamstrung on all of these different issues because it will always be possible for either Farage or Starmer to push back and say, well, hold on, you know, you're trying to outflank me, but every time, the more you outflank me, the more inconsistent you are with the regime that you propped up for 14 years. Well, that's definitely
Badenoch's paradox. I mean, when I talked to her, she made a point of indicating that she was a very early skeptic, for example, of the net zero fiasco and had objected to it from the beginning. Now, you could debate about whether she had objected with sufficient strenuousness, but she is trying to differentiate herself from her forebears. And whether
it wasn't her brief, the principle of collective cabinet ministerial responsibility is an important one, and so she would have aired her grievances internally, no doubt, but it's probably not fair to blame her for not resigning on
well, it's matter, also perhaps, up to her to differentiate herself and also to indicate that the Conservative Party has undergone a sufficient transformation to actually change, which it likely hasn't.
One of the issues she has been consistent on and probably did more than any other Tory minister to fight was the issue that catapulted you to fame way back in 2016, the issue of transgenderism and all of the coercive policies on speech and single-sex spaces that flowed out of that. Mm-hmm. As you look back on that period, you know, you were a voice in the wilderness of immense courage back in 2016. I think that's where you first came on my radar, at least. Do you feel a sense of vindication, of satisfaction, as you see, not everywhere, but significant swathes of the West now, sanity is beginning to return on this issue? Would you think would you sense a sort of victory there, a sort of personal satisfaction? Could more be done? Is it?
Well, I feel that the sort of relief that you might feel if you saw a terrible predator lurking in the bushes and you were, you know, fortunate enough to lead people away from its jaws, even though it had devoured some. It's hard to feel any personal satisfaction, partly because with regards to the gender issue, there's been thousands and thousands of young people who've been butchered in its name. And maybe it's receded, although we'll see about that. These proclivities are a lot more pernicious than anybody optimistic might presume. You know, Trump has made so-called gender-affirming care, which is the most pernicious misnaming that Satan himself could possibly imagine. He's put a serious stick in the spokes of that particular bicycle, but I wouldn't get too triumphalist about it yet. The nature worshippers and the transhumanists haven't been defeated by any stretch of the imagination.